by, as is not unusual, the state authorities. My understanding is thus far, I don't think it's fully complete, which is not, again, not totally unusual. But so far, nothing remarkable on that front.
That's from the body itself, but from actually the scene where the shooter was found, is everything consistent with the testimony, the physical evidence at the scene? Is that consistent with the testimony you've seen, that you've heard so far?
So far, yes. Again, ongoing investigation.
Were you able to determine whether the shooter took the gun up with him when he climbed up to the top of the roof, or was it already placed there somewhere?
So that is something that we're drilling into right now that we don't know the answer to yet. I can tell you, which may be relevant, though, to your question, that, and I don't think this has been reported yet, that the weapon had a collapsible stock, which could explain why it might have been less easy for people to observe. You know, because one of the things that we're finding is people have observed him. The first people to observe him with the weapon were when he was already on the roof, and we haven't yet found anybody with firsthand observation of him with the weapon walking around beforehand. So that doesn't mean he wasn't, obviously, but the collapsible stock is potentially a very significant feature that might be relevant to that.
Did he have a scope?
I believe so, but as I sit here right now, I don't remember.
Okay. You mentioned about 2 hours before the incident that he'd had a drone and he was using a drone. Instead of me putting words in your mouth, just tell me how you discovered the drone, how you discovered the time, and how you discovered, if you can describe what he would have been observing with the drone and how you determined that, please.
So this is something that's very much ongoing right now. We're going back and forth with our lab as they continue to do work on it. What I would say is the drone was in his car. As I said, we've been able to, by exploiting the drone, determine, its use and flight paths. There were no pictures or videos on the drone of the day of the rally, for example, but we have been able to reverse engineer the flight path of the drone from the day of the rally, and that's how we know that for about 11 minutes, from I think it's around 3:50 p.m. to 4 p.m., somewhere in that range, he was flying the drone, and we have the flight path. It's about 200 yards away from where former President Trump would ultimately be speaking. And so that would have primarily given him a vantage point. I'm trying to think how to describe this. If the former president's podium is that way, yeah, the drone would be over here looking, say 200 yards again off this way, looking back. So it would have shown the shooter, we think, again, we're still doing more work on this. I really want to qualify what I'm saying, but I'm trying to be transparent and lean in here. We think it would have shown him kind of what would have been behind him.
But when you say behind him, behind the shooter? Correct.
Like, in other words, almost like giving him a rear view mirror of the scene behind him, except again, he wasn't flying it overhead while he was later back.
Because the stage, I assume, was already set, he would have been able to assess that angle with Rooftop as well, forward and backward, I assume.
Well, certainly going towards the podium. Again, we're still trying to figure out exactly what he saw, because we're having to, in effect, because there's no recording of what he saw during those 11 minutes, our hypothesis at this point, the experts think he would have been live streaming it. And so we're trying to, in effect, say, okay, well, if this was the flight pattern, given these capabilities of the drone, what would you have seen? What could you have seen for those 11 minutes? And again, it wasn't over the stage or the kind of the hub of the rally. It was about 200 yards away, but it looks like it would have been looking, let's say, length of a football field or so, more, kind of towards the podium.
Great, thank you, Mr.
How many separate times was the shooter on the premises?
So again, with the caveat that we're continuing to do work on it, we believe that the first time he traveled to the grounds was, I think, a week before, and he spent roughly 20 minutes there. Then he went to the grounds again on the morning of the event, it appears. for about 70 minutes, I think. But again, I qualify that. I'd have to go back and look to be sure of that part. And then he came back in the afternoon, so that would be, I guess, a third time for good. But that included things like this drone activity we just talked about.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, thank you for appearing. Thank you for the extraordinary job that you're doing. Please convey our thanks to the men and women at the Bureau for their incredible work. I've worked with them since I was an assistant U.S. attorney more than 30 years ago. Let me start with a threshold question I'm curious about. When I applied to be an assistant U.S. attorney, I had to go through a background check. Do candidates for the FBI have to go through background checks?
Yes.
Would someone with dozens of felony convictions survive a background check for the Bureau?
No.
So they would never be hired by the Bureau?
No.
Well, clearly the Bureau has, you don't have to comment on this, I know you won't, but clearly the Bureau has higher standards for their hiring than one of America's great political parties. Let me turn to the events of the tragic shooting. Have you been able to gain access to the shooter's electronic communications, social media, and with the caveats that you mentioned that the investigation is still early, have you been able to make any deductions or are there any indications of the shooter's motivation from those electronic holdings?
So in terms of our ability to access it, we have been able to get into and exploit a number of electronic devices, digital devices, but not all of them yet. And then within his various accounts, we've been able to get access to some of them, but some of them we're still waiting on. Some of them we may never get access to because of the encryption issue, that it presents an increasingly vexing barrier for law enforcement, not just the FBI, but for law enforcement all over the country. But we're still drilling into that. We have some information. Some places we've been able to look. Some places we will be able to look. Some places we may never be able to see, no matter how good our legal process is. But that's what we're looking at right now. In terms of what we've been able to find so far, a lot of the usual repositories of information have not yielded anything notable in terms of motive or like ideology. Having said that, it does appear fairly clear that he was interested in public figures, kind of more broadly, and I think this is important, that starting somewhere around July 6th or so, he became very focused on former President Trump and this rally. And so one of the things that I can share here today that has not been shared yet is that we've just in the last couple of days found that from our review, to your point about devices, analysis of a laptop that the investigation ties to the shooter reveals that on July 6th, he did a Google search for, quote, how far away was Oswald from Kennedy? And so that's a search that obviously is significant in terms of his state of mind. That is the same day that it appears that he registered for the Butler rally.
And when you say that his electronic holdings indicated an interest in different public figures, without revealing anything you're not comfortable revealing about those public figures, can you tell us anything generally about them, either the offices they hold, their political party, or was it simply people of a high profile?
Well, a couple things. First, the images that we've recovered so far from, I can't remember which of his various devices, appear to be what we call cached images from searches of news articles. So if you do a news article search, of course, if there are photos on it, those photos get stored automatically in your cache, as opposed to me searching or him searching for a specific person and getting up images of that person. As far as the pictures that are like that, doesn't seem to be a whole lot of rhyme or reason to it so far, other than these are, all prominent public people, but they cover both parties, they cover both U.S. people and even some foreign public officials. So that part doesn't appear to, that one repository of information doesn't appear to be overly indicative of motive, other than interest in public figures, but that could be just because he was reading news stories. So we're still trying to drill into that. That's why all of these outstanding legal process returns that we're waiting on for various accounts, platforms, et cetera, any one of them could be one that would have very indicative, very important information.
If I could be permitted one very short additional question, Chairman. From that, any indication of any other particular target, that is someone who was not just sort of generically the subject of the searches you described, but for which there was more of an interest than others?
There's the information I just described at the moment does not appear particularly indicative of targeting in its own right. But again, that dot, once we get other information, could connect in a way that might be more meaningful. But I'm sharing that piece of information with this committee and with the American public, but I think it's important that we put down a qualification. This does not appear to be some kind of target list or something like that. This is cached images from running searches of news stories. And again, there's nothing at the moment, there's no pattern from that particular piece of information that is overly remarkable so far.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Director, you previously told us that you consider the situation on the southern border to be a massive security threat to our country. Is that still your assessment?
I stand by my prior testimony, and in fact, just in the last month or so, we've done, conducted a significant series of arrests. I say we, our Joint Terrorism Task Force is working with ICE of a number of individuals with suspected international terrorism ties, and I have also been very vocal about the fact that since the last time I appeared before you, that we are increasingly concerned about the possibility not just of a foreign terrorist-inspired attack, which is very much a concern, but even the potential for a coordinated foreign terrorist attack, perhaps like what we've seen against the concert hall in Russia, for example, but just here in the United States.
Well, the 19 suicide bombers who overstayed visas were responsible for 3,000 American deaths on 9/11. What's your best estimate of the number of foreign terrorists who are now in our country?
I don't know that I could give you that number. What I can tell you is we have lots of foreign terrorism-related investigations, but that doesn't mean that all of them came in, illegally or anything like that.
It seems to me that the simplest act of terrorism would be for dozens of guerrillas to attack low-security, high-density venues, for example, Friday night high school football games all across the country at the same hour with bombs and automatic weapons. That would produce thousands of casualties from coast to coast in a matter of minutes. How likely is such a scenario?
Well, what you're describing would require, of course, a lot of coordination. But what I will tell you, and I think you're onto a particularly important point from my perspective, which is that unlike the 9/11 attacks, which, again, I was in FBI headquarters on the day of 9/11, and so I remember it vividly, and I've spent plenty of time in the period after that in my prior positions engaged with the families and the victims. But what we're seeing more and more with the foreign terrorist threat, and frankly also the domestic terrorism threat, is a focus on kind of like what you're talking about, well, what I would call soft targets, which is really for the American people's benefit, just intelligence community speak for where everyday people live their everyday lives.
What terrorist groups have now infiltrated our country that you're tracking?
Well, I don't know that I would say infiltrated. We have investigations as we speak that relate to ISIS and its affiliates. We have investigations as we speak that relate to Al-Qaeda. We have investigations as we speak that relate to Al-Shabaab. We have investigations as we speak that relate to the Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, and so frankly, even the IRGC Quds Force itself.
What foreign criminal gangs are now in our country that you're most concerned with?
Well, foreign criminal gangs, I mean, we obviously have investigations, a lot of investigations into, gangs like MS-13, for example, and some of its counterparts. Although I think if you were to talk to most chiefs and sheriffs like I'm doing every week, we shouldn't underestimate how prevalent neighborhood gangs are, really. It's a lot of the gang violence.
I'm concerned about those that we've allowed in through the southern border and what threat they are now posing. Do you believe that the vetting performed at the southwest border is adequate to ensure that aliens with terrorist or criminal gang ties are not being released into the United States?
Well, it's not really for me to speak to the vetting. What I would tell you is that
you have to deal with it once they're released into the United States.
And one of the concerns that I have, which I touched on briefly in my opening, is there's been a lot of focus on the number of known or suspected terrorists encountered at the border, and that number has increased over the last 5 or 6 years, and that should be of concern. But frankly, to me, the bigger concern is individuals who weren't either weren't on the watch list at the time they came in because there wasn't information known yet that ties them to terrorism, and it's only after they get in that some new piece of information develops somewhere overseas, and now we know. That's a bigger concern.
We've been warned that they basically vet against a blank sheet of paper. If they don't have a record in this country, Border Patrol probably doesn't have any record. They're released into the country, and you find out later of the dangers.
Right, or if they use fake documents and there aren't biometrics to connect them. Sometimes there are people who come in who, because of the nature of the threat information that puts somebody on the watch list, there wasn't, fingerprints from the person at the time, because not every piece of intelligence comes with fingerprints. So then the guy comes in using fake ID,
and of course,
there's no reason to connect them.
And of course, the 2 million gotaways you know absolutely nothing about.
Exactly.
Well, I don't know about absolutely nothing, because we may come across them in other things. I mean, one of the key parts of our collective defense here is that we work with 800,000 sworn law enforcement across the country, and we train them on the right questions to ask and things like that, so that we can build in additional eyes and ears if they, do a traffic stop or whatever happens to be. We run a greater chance of leveraging all that to pick up people who may have slipped through the cracks.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Director, we're about 100 days until the election. Russia has attacked our democracy in past elections. Are they seeking to do it in this one?
We assess that the Russian government continues to want to influence and in various ways interfere with our democracy, with our electoral process. In fact, just in the last few weeks, we announced a significant disruption of a generative AI-enhanced social media, bot farm, essentially, of the Russians that was designed to be an influence operation, and some of the fictitious profiles of those bots purported to be U.S. persons. So they're still at it. We've seen that in election cycle after election cycle.
Do the Russians have a preferred candidate?
I'm not sure that I could speak to that here, but certainly what I would tell you is it's not just the Russians, and I think that's important for people to know too. There's a lot of attention to the Russians, as there should be, but we also know, you may recall that in 2020, Director Ratcliffe and I announced an effort by the Iranians to try to interfere, and more recently, we've had indictments related to China. 34 Chinese MPS officers creating fictitious personas, posting false information online, full of narratives designed to sow divisiveness, discord, undermine us. And I'm talking about narratives that they were pushing, again, purporting to be Americans, but actually Chinese MPS officers. For example, trashing any suggestion that COVID came from a lab leak,
Right.
or trashing U.S. law enforcement on the occasion of the anniversary of George Floyd's death.
And shifting to the attempted assassination on the former president, I want to make it clear, in America, violence has never been the answer. Not on a certain day in January or a recent day in July. And I just want to go through the shooting just briefly with you. How many armed officers were within the perimeter, just ballpark figure?
You know, that really goes to the security posture, which is the subject of the DHS Inspector General's review and the outside panel, independent panel that's
Would you say probably more than 100, though?
I have to believe that number, but I don't have that number at my fingertips. Our focus is on the shooter and his attack.
And the shooter was able to get 8 shots off before he was killed.
That's what it would appear, yes.
Type of weapon used by the shooter was an assault rifle?
Was an AR-style rifle,
So that means one trigger pull, one round. Is that right?
essentially.
Do you like to shoot?
Do I?
Yeah.
Yeah, yes.
Do you know the difference between an AR and a bolt action rifle?
I'm not going to try to sit here and engage on sort of firearms expertise, but I've fired a variety of weapons. But
Had the shooter used a bolt action rifle, would that have been one trigger pull, one round?
that's my understanding.
Would there had to have been more, well, on an assault rifle, trigger pull, round, bolt action, non-assault rifle, what's the difference? Is it faster, slower?
He was able to get more rounds off more quickly than he would have with other kinds of weapons.
And that's my point, is that we can add additional resources to protect political candidates, and we should. The people who went to that rally deserved to be protected from gun violence, just like the students at Parkland deserve to be protected from gun violence, just like the babies at Sandy Hook deserve to be protected from gun violence. So we'll devote more resources. We've added a presidential candidate who is also now protected. But if we're being honest with ourselves, we have armed this country to the teeth. And we have allowed the most dangerous people to have access to the most dangerous weapons. I say that as a parent of a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, the 2 oldest who have done multiple mass shooter drills in their classrooms. I say that as a brother to 2 police officers who walk a very violent beat. And I say that as an elected official who believes that my colleagues deserve to be as safe as I deserve to be when we are at political rallies. And so we really need to step back and think, if we allow these weapons to be in our country, can we truly protect our elected officials, and can we truly protect, most importantly, our children and the next generation? I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. It is good to have Mr. Massey back with us today. Some of us had a chance to go to Kentucky over the last few weeks and visit with Thomas and his family and hear all kinds of wonderful stories about Rhonda. Amazing, amazing lady, gentle spirit, and we're glad to have Mr. Massey back with us. And the next 5 minutes belong to you, Congressman.
Thank you, Chairman. Director Wray, how many counter snipers were present at the rally that day, and which of the counter snipers took the shot that took out the would-be assassin?
I don't have the number of counter snipers. I know it was the Secret Service counter sniper who took the shot that eliminated the shooter. And we've conducted a number of interviews, including of him.
So was it one of the 2 that we see in the videos on top of the roof, or was it a different location that shot?
I'm afraid I don't have that at my fingertips here.
Okay. You mentioned that the would-be assassin bought a 5-foot ladder. You have a credit card evidence of that. But it looks like on the scene there was a larger ladder that he might have used. Do you know which ladder he used to get to the roof? And do you have possession of that 5-foot ladder and the other ladder? And do you know how the taller ladder got to the scene?
So this whole business about the ladder is something we're drilling into more. We do have possession of the 5-foot ladder that he purchased close in time to his attempted assassination. That we've traced the purchase of that ladder from a receipt, a bloodied receipt that he had on him at the time his body was recovered on the roof. We do not yet know for sure how exactly he got up on the roof. We're looking at, various forensic pieces to try to kind of piece that together. So more to come on that.
Do you know where the 5-foot ladder was found or retrieved? Was it near the roof, or was it still in his vehicle?
Neither. I don't have it in front of me, but I know that it was not. I know that it was not on scene, and I know that it was not in his vehicle. But we can circle back to you and get
Okay.
to that.
Is there any evidence at all that he may have been in contact with somebody else before this occurred that may have had any prior knowledge or may have helped him plan this event?
Well, needless to say, that is a question that we're intensely focused on, because that would obviously be incredibly meaningful. So far, underline, so far, we have not found any evidence of any accomplices or co-conspirators, foreign or domestic.
And you're using geolocation data to see if his cell phone was near another cell phone, I presume?
Right, we're doing lots of different kinds of cellular analysis, geolocation stuff, looking at his accounts. He, from everything we've seen, which is consistent with what we've learned in interviews, a lot of people describe him as a loner. That does kind of fit with what we're seeing in his devices. His list of contacts, for example, is very short, compared to what you would normally see from most people. So it doesn't appear to be a whole lot of interaction between him, face-to-face or digital with a lot of people.
Okay, thank you.
That doesn't mean there's not any, and that's why we're drilling into. We're trying to talk to anybody who's had any engagement with him whatsoever, digital, in person, classmates, coworkers,
Right.
et cetera.
Appreciate that. And now I want to talk about another possible assassination attempt. And I'll start by showing a video of President Biden. And this is from recently. This is in the last month, if we can play that.
Gallows erected to hang the Vice President, Mike Pence. I think it's fair to say it's one of the darkest days in the history of America.
Okay, and he's referring to January 6th. Were there gallows erected to hang Mike Pence, as the president says here?
I'm not aware of any physical gallows. I can't remember whether, from a demonstration perspective, there may not have been some kind of replica or symbol of something like that.
That's my impression. Can we show? Can you raise that up so you can see it? It looks like there was some kind of prop that was built. The construction doesn't look like it lends itself to actually hanging somebody. It's more of a prop, I think, as you suggested, that was erected on January 6th. But if the president were correct that these gallows were erected to hang Mike Pence, that would be a very serious allegation, wouldn't it?
I would take it very seriously, yes.
Has anybody been arrested, or do you have any leads in conjunction with the erection of this gallows? We had a picture here on the screen, if you can show it again. It was just up there. There's an individual here who's seen near these gallows. Has he been arrested? Have you identified this person?
I don't know that I could speak to this specific person or the gallows that are pictured on the image. We have had, I think, 850 people who have pled guilty to federal crimes related to January 6th, and I think another 180, I think it is, convicted at trials. So I can't be sure.
And some of them merely for going into the Capitol, but here the president suggests that individual intended to hang Vice President Pence, which seems like kind of a wild claim myself, given the construction of those gallows. But if we are to take him seriously, or even if we aren't, let me just finish by saying this. If you have no leads, or you're not sure if anybody who erected those gallows was arrested or is being investigated, were there any confidential human sources involved from the FBI or any other agency in the erection of that prop, those gallows?
I'm not aware of anything like that.
All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Director Wray. Political violence of any kind is dangerous, unlawful, and totally unacceptable. just as we all watched and then unequivocally condemned the attempted assassination attempt on our former president, I wish that we could all come together to unequivocally condemn the act of political violence on January 6th, instead of defending props that were used, that were harmful, dangerous props of gallows, attempting to show what people wanted to do to Vice President Pence. Extremists attempted to subvert our democracy in the worst assault on the U.S. Capitol since the War of 1812. Many of us were trapped in the gallery that day. We feared we would not make it out. Insurrectionists were chasing down former Speaker Nancy Pelosi and then Vice President Mike Pence. And I myself have been the direct target of political violence when an armed man with a gun showed up at my door, threatened me and my family, and we actually ended up having to move our home. So I understand the increased tenor of political violence that is racking our country. It has been on the rise, fomented by violent and dehumanizing rhetoric from top public officials, including the former president and members of Congress, sadly, and bolstered by the proliferation of easily accessible guns, including assault-style weapons. All of this violence is unacceptable, and I wholeheartedly condemn it. I just hope we condemn all of the violence, not just one or two incidents. Mr. Wray, today I want to focus on the role of the FBI and the need for the Bureau to remain politically neutral and independent. The FBI cannot and should not be subject to the whims of any president. The majority apparently doesn't think that the FBI needs to be politically neutral and independent. They want an FBI subordinate to the president, not accountable to the American people. That is one part of a larger plan to undermine our democracy, to remove the checks and balances that have protected us, and ultimately to subvert our freedoms. That agenda, promulgated by the former president, his loyalists, and their MAGA allies, is called Project 2025. It is publicly available online. I encourage everyone who's watching this to Google it. It includes plans to undermine every part of our government, including the FBI. Trump's Project 2025 agenda says that the director of the FBI must not be independent of politics, but instead must do whatever the president orders. Under Trump's Project 2025, Trump loyalists would undermine the non-political and independent structure of the FBI. Project 2025 openly calls on the next conservative administration to support, quote, a vast expansion of the number of political appointees in every office across the DOJ, especially the FBI. And so, Mr. Wray, given your extensive experience as a law enforcement professional at DOJ across multiple Republican and Democratic administrations, why do you think it's important that the FBI maintain political independence from the president?
I think the FBI is and needs to stay independent, and that means protecting the American people without fear or favor, upholding the Constitution and the rule of law, and it means following the facts wherever they lead, no matter who likes it. And I add that last part because the essence of independence and objectivity is not that an investigation is going to always yield the result you want. Our independence and objectivity can't only be respected when you like the outcome. That's the very essence of objectivity. Sometimes you're going to like the result, sometimes you're not going to like the result. And that applies to everyone, including us. Any number of times we're disappointed and frustrated by the results of our investigations. But the alternative is an erosion of the rule of law, where the only thing that distinguishes one investigation from another is power. And that's what you see in some of authoritarian countries around the world. So I'm not familiar with this particular
No, I didn't ask you to
Project
comment on that.
2025
No,
thing. I don't
know
know anything about it, but what I can tell you is, from my perspective, the FBI needs to be functioning as independent. Doesn't mean it's not part of the executive branch. It doesn't mean the FBI director doesn't serve at the pleasure of the president, but it does mean that the way we do our work
has to be objective.
Has to be independent.
Yeah, thank you. I have another question about the role of attorneys at the FBI Office of General Counsel. How do we protect that work?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
The role, what role do the attorneys at the FBI Office of General Counsel play in ensuring that the Bureau respects the constitutional rights of American citizens? How do we protect that work?
So in my experience, the lawyers in the Office of General Counsel play an incredibly important role in ensuring that our agents have their questions about how to comply with the law and conducting their work answered, and ensuring that we conduct our work in the right way, which means scrupulously adhering to the laws and the rules that apply to us.
I just wanted to say before I yield, Mr. Chairman, that the Project 2025 also eliminates the FBI's Office of General Counsel in-house lawyers who are responsible for that role. I appreciate your indulgence, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Wisconsin's recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it was when you were here December of last year, Mr. Wray, that you said blinking lights were going off in regards to the southern border and what is happening down there. Has the border situation improved in terms of your assessment with the security of Americans since you were last here in December?
Well, I guess a couple things, and I appreciate the question. So first, the blinking lights comment that I made refers more broadly to the threat environment that I'm seeing as FBI director across a wide range of threats. Contributing to that in a variety of ways are the threats that emanate from the border. So it's not a comment just on the border issues, it's the threat environment that we face more broadly, in my experience in law enforcement. I am increasingly concerned that foreign terrorists could seek to exploit vulnerabilities at our southwest border or at other ports of entry or in other aspects of our immigration system to facilitate an attack here in the United States. I think that is something we have to be concerned about. There's been a lot of focus on numbers of this, numbers of that, and I understand that. But as I think was referenced in an earlier question, it doesn't take very many foreign terrorists to be a real problem. We had 19 hijackers responsible for the 9/11 attacks. And we just not that long ago had a case, some of the members of the committee will remember, where we charged an individual for trying to smuggle individuals in to assassinate former President Bush.
Are you concerned that the Border Patrol chief, former Border Patrol chief Rodney Scott, said that he was concerned about very, very minuscule data that they're receiving? So there's all this, we are told that illegal aliens are vetted against databases, but oftentimes they're doing biometrics as they come into this country, but not looking behind it in their home countries. Does that concern you when there's not a review done in the home country?
Well, we certainly need as much help as we can get from the countries of origin of these people. When I say origin, not just where they come from originally, but countries they've come through. And the biometric enrollment piece is, of course, an important one. We have situations where even if...
Are we doing a thorough enough job of reviewing them, their actions and their lives in their home countries before they came here?
Well, I mean, we need more help from our foreign partners. There's no question about that. And I think that's an important part of it.
Our domestic partners, like the CIA and others that are supposed to protect us.
So there's been a lot of discussion, of course, over the last several years about the pivot to what's called the hard targets, right? The understandable focus, which I support, of focusing on the threat posed by China and Russia and Iran. But with that comes, if you look at, for example, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, we start to lose sources of information about foreign terrorist threats from overseas, and that is a concern to me.
Yeah, my time's running out. Has Vice President Harris met with you in regards to the border?
Well, I've been in meetings that have included the Vice President that have in different ways touched on border
issues. Has she
issues.
specifically asked you for a meeting in regards to the threat that is at the border?
You know, I'm not going to get into sort of specific meetings, but I can tell you that I've been in meetings that have included, among other people, the Vice President that touch on border security issues.
Did she ask you questions about what you thought needed to be done in regards to reducing this threat to the American people?
You know, I really can't get into specific conversations.
Is support for President Trump a security concern within the FBI?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear it.
Is support for President Trump a security concern amongst your employees?
No.
Is objection to the COVID-19 vaccine a security threat?
Not from my perspective.
Who improved what is termed the Trump questionnaire within the FBI that was done by SIIS? Dina Perkins, Jeffrey Ventry were behind it. Who was responsible for that? And did you know that there was a Trump questionnaire out there?
So the document you're asking about is an interview outline that we only recently learned about, and in my view is completely inappropriate. I asked my team to get to the bottom of what happened and to ensure that doesn't happen again, and I've learned that it's not an FBI form, that its use was isolated, that it was created not by an FBI employee, but by an outside contractor, and that individual is no longer affiliated with the FBI. But we are sending what we have found to the Office of Inspector General, and we'll cooperate, of course, with anything they find.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just close with this. We keep hearing about these isolated examples, whether it's Richmond Catholics, this instance. Isn't it a pattern? I yield back.
Gentleman goes back, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Director Wray, welcome again to this committee, and I want to thank you and your agents for the good job you're doing to protect Americans. Earlier this week, I was part of the group that went out to visit Butler, Pennsylvania Homeland Security members. I agree with my colleagues that have said violence has no part in our democracy. And I trust you will investigate the events surrounding July 13th thoroughly. I'm going to ask you a question. I hope you'll keep it in mind as your investigation proceeds, which is, who's in charge? Who's in charge at a campaign rally, setting it up? Secret Service or a campaign? And I ask this question because when I was there, had a couple of law enforcement individuals alluding to that question as well. They gave me an example. They said, if a Secret Service says you need to set up a line of dump trucks behind the stage to protect the candidate, and the campaign says that's bad optics, who ends up winning the debate? So my question is, who's in charge? And as you investigate this crime scene, hope you ask the locally elected officials. I spoke to a county supervisor, local police and sheriff. They all had information they wanted us to know, to relay. We just didn't have the opportunity to sit down and talk to them. There was a lot of concern that they weren't given enough time to prepare for this rally. They thought there were things that could have been done better. And ultimately, what I keep thinking, what I keep coming back to is question, who's in charge at these rallies? I think it's an important one because we have an election right around the corner. Pennsylvania, Butler, these areas, battleground states around the country will continue to be areas where our candidates, both sides, will show up, and the threats will continue to be there. So I hope, Director Wray, that you'll keep that statement in mind as you continue to investigate this crime scene.
Well, I appreciate the question. I will tell you that we've conducted well over 400 interviews, but we have many more still to conduct. And as is not unusual in an investigation, I'm sure there will be situations where we have to go back to people we've already interviewed with follow-up questions. And our interviews cover a wide range of people. I do think it's important to make sure that the committee and the American people understand the scope of our investigation versus the scope of others. Our investigation is focused on the shooter and his attack. There is, of course, and I understand completely why, there are two separate reviews, one by the DHS Inspector General and the other by this outside independent panel that's been announced, that are focused on the security posture, the adequacy of the security posture at the rally, Secret Service decision-making and actions and things like that. And so I certainly understand why there are all those questions, but those are in scope of those two other reviews, and of course, whatever Congress chooses to do. Our investigation, though, because of our interviews of people who are on the scene, will relate to that in some ways, and we're going to share whatever we learn that's relevant with those other reviews.
Director Wray, my last minute that I have, I'm going to flip quickly to your good job resources. Earlier this year in the Appropriations Committee, you testified that you were, for 2024, your budget was $500 million below what you needed to sustain your 2023 efforts. A few minutes ago, you talked about foreign terrorists. The last few weeks, I know information has emerged. That information came from FISA information that was able to be collected overseas on these possible terrorist threats. What we have here today is a domestic terrorist, what looks to be a lone wolf. Your statements, there's nothing really there that would have tipped anybody off to this individual. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Well, I don't know that I'd go quite that far because we're still investigating a lot related to the shooter. It does appear so far that we're seeing less in his...
My 6 seconds,
Yep.
I would just say, I would ask that you let us know what resources you need to protect the American public and our candidates in our democratic system.
I appreciate the question. I would just say this. We are in, as I've said consistently today and for quite some time now, we are in an elevated threat environment covering a wide range of threats, and the FBI is central to protecting the American people from those threats. And state and local law enforcement, who depend on us every day, rely on us for all sorts of services, databases, forensic support, training. I could go on and on and on. And a lot of those departments, unlike the FBI, have had a hard time recruiting. And so this is not a time to pull back on our funding because we're going to leave our brothers and sisters in state and local law enforcement twisting in the wind, and then by extension, the American people we're all collectively sworn to protect.
Thank you, and Mr. Chair, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Director Wray, for being here. When did you last speak with President Biden?
I don't have the exact date, but it's been certainly since the since the shooting.
So you have spoken to the president since the assassination attempt on President Trump's life?
Yes, sir.
And what was the mental state of the president?
We had a perfectly professional conversation.
And are you, do you have any scheduled briefings of the president upcoming?
Not at the moment specifically scheduled, no.
In 2016 and 2015, top FBI officials infamously texted about, quote, their insurance policy to make sure Trump was never elected or inaugurated as president. Have any FBI agents texted, emailed, or expressed disappointment that Trump survived the assassination attempt or otherwise editorialized about the assassination attempt?
I don't know about any agents. There have been at least 2 instances, I think, or 1 instance of an individual who posted something that I consider outrageous and totally inappropriate and unacceptable. And that individual has been referred to our inspection division, which is the arm, our sort of internal affairs investigatory arm that does the disciplinary process.
Okay. Will you report back to this committee any other incidents?
I'll do my best to share information with the committee.
You testified earlier that the FBI maintains high standards irrespective of so-called diversity efforts. Is it true that in December of 2016, former Director Comey lowered the passing standards for Phase 1, allowing an influx of previously unqualified applicants to continue in the hiring process who normally would have been stopped back in December of 2016?
Yeah, I can't speak to Director Comey's
what were the
changes. I can tell you that at least since I've been director, changes that we have made to...
Well, we're standing on a specific question. Were standards changed? Phase 1, this is a specific part of the process. Were they changed in 2016?
Well, I don't recall if they were changed in 2016. Obviously, I started, as your question presupposes, after that. What I can tell you is, since that time, we have made changes to various phases of the process, but none of them, this is important, none of them lowered the standards. In fact, if anything, they actually increased.
Are you familiar with reporting that we have, and we've asked questions to you about this, I'm not sure the result of the questions, that to more, quote, easily accommodate a large pool of available applicants, FBI special agent hiring standards have been relaxed and requirements measurably lowered. This according to a group of former agents who have testified about this and written a report and submitted it to Congress. In addition, specifically, minority people with 20-year careers, one in particular, a minority served for more than 20 years, wrote in this report and submitted it to Congress saying that these standards were in fact lowered, and that in fact, if you were hiring, you were moved off of hiring if you put quality above these kinds of DEI requirements. Do you reject this report? And do you have comments on this report?
I haven't read.
You're aware of the report.
I'm aware of the report. I know that I've read every detail of it, but I can tell you that the claim that we have lowered our standards to be less selective and less competitive is not accurate.
So do you believe these former agents are lying to Congress when they submit a report to Congress stipulating and suggesting otherwise? Or are you saying that they are lying?
I'm saying they're mistaken.
Okay, but they're affirmatively on the record. They're telling us and submitting a report to Congress saying that those facts are directly in contradicting what you're testifying here today. So I just want to be clear so we know we're saying that they are submitting evidence to our record to the contrary that you say is untruthful.
I encounter all the time when I travel around the country and have conversations with our agents, and one of the things I try to do is have meetings with some of the longer serving agents without executive management.
That's okay. My only question is that,
and my point here's
the implication is it's untruthful. So, but I need to move on. I got 1 minute left. Are you familiar with the case of Paulette Harlow? She's a 75-year-old elderly woman from Massachusetts with a debilitating medical condition. She was prosecuted for violating the FACE Act and sentenced to 2 years in prison. She has to go to Texas in 2 weeks. She was praying at an abortion clinic in Washington, D.C. The FBI interrogated and investigated her. Do you think it is appropriate for a 75-year-old woman who is praying at a clinic in D.C. to be put in prison for 2 years for that activity? Just a simple question. Do you think that's appropriate?
I'm not familiar with the specific case.
You're not familiar with that case. It's been significantly in the headlines. But you don't know how to comment on that case, that it's appropriate for a 75-year-old woman to be put in prison for 2 years for praying at a clinic.
Again, since I'm not familiar with the case, I don't want to start weighing in because I don't know all the facts. But what I can tell you is that when it comes to FACE Act enforcement and abortion-related violent extremism, I think one of the things that gets lost, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify it, is that really since the Dobbs decision, actually more of our abortion-related violent extremism investigations have focused on violence against pro-life facilities as opposed to the other way around. And we've had a number of investigations. We're using FACE Act resources and our JTTFs.
We're still waiting on responses on letters that we've sent indicating the data to the contrary, that there's been significant amount of efforts in targeting of people who are pro-lifers who go to clinics and that they've been prosecuted, like this case, a 75-year-old woman who is now going to jail in Texas for 2 years because she was praying at a clinic in Washington, D.C. And we've submitted questions on that, and I'd appreciate a response on it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Director Wray, for being here and for the work that your team does, as well as for sharing the information that you've been able to today. You just got a couple questions about that seem to imply that there was some problem with the FBI's diversity efforts, and certainly the 1950s version of the FBI was singularly Caucasian male agents, et cetera. Is the FBI a better force for having a diverse range of employees and agents?
I think diversity makes us better, but like everything else, it has to be done the right way. Mm-hmm. I think we can have a more diverse workforce and do it without lowering our standards, and that's, in my view, what we've done.
And you haven't lowered standards at the FBI?
We have not. I repeatedly come across people who are confused about different parts of that, and I appreciate the opportunity to set that straight.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're all concerned here as we've seen the rollout of this Project 2025 that purports to try to eliminate any reference to diversity efforts across the entire federal government. So it is sort of a top-of-mind concern as it's threatening to become reality. So what I did want to talk about today is something some of my colleagues have mentioned, which is the normalization of threats and violence against public servants at all levels, whether it's election workers or school officials, elected officials and their families, judges, federal law enforcement agents, and others. To be clear, I think it's very clear that the majority of Americans wholeheartedly condemn any sort of political violence and understand that it's not legitimate discourse and that it has no place in our civic life. But words do matter, and they have consequences, particularly when uttered by people in positions of leadership. So that's why I remain very concerned by the willingness of some members of Congress to repeat disinformation and conspiracy theories that undermine trust in our public institutions, which serve all Americans. And when elected officials embrace overheated or fact-free rhetoric, it becomes dangerous. I have been heartened, as many national leaders have unequivocally condemned calls to violence, and I would urge all members of this body to do so and continue to do so, regardless of the party affiliation of the perpetrators or the targets of such threats. You and our other national security officials have repeatedly warned us that foreign actors are actively working to spread disinformation, to influence our elections and discredit our public institutions, and we shouldn't be aiding and abetting them. So to live in a country that we aspire to, where our most valued democratic processes like free and fair elections can be carried out unimpeded, and people can run for office, serve their communities, and exercise their right to vote without fear of violence, we've had some concerns about violence around our elections. In 2020, the endorsement and promulgation of falsehoods about the election results by the former president and his campaign led to threats and attacks against election officials and poll workers in Pennsylvania. And those falsehoods also wasted millions of taxpayer dollars on frivolous lawsuits and extraordinary security costs. So as we're again approaching November, we want to ensure that those who implement and defend our elections, our neighbors and our nonpartisan civil servants, can do that important work free from conspiracy theories and threats. So we know our local law enforcement across Pennsylvania are preparing for some disruption and threats because while Pennsylvania may be a battleground state in the upcoming election, that battle should obviously be a war of words over policy and the vision we're charting for our country's future, not an actual civil war. So how is the FBI working with state and local law enforcement to prevent and respond to election-related violence, particularly against election workers?
So in a variety of ways, we're partnering with state and local law enforcement. Obviously, the physical security in the first instance, in most of the respects you're talking about, is in the ordinary course, the responsibility of state and local law enforcement. But we play an important role in a number of ways. So we share, threat bulletins, information like that about things to be on the lookout for, things we're seeing. If we ever have specific threat information, then we work to get it to the right people. We have election crime coordinators, which we've had for decades in all 56 field offices, who have existing relationship with not just state and local law enforcement, but election officials, especially focused on security and threat-related issues. And then, of course, we're participating in the Election Threats Task Force that DOJ set up, which is focused on threats of violence or actual violence against election workers specifically. And we've had a number of arrests and even some convictions already on that.
Okay. Thank you for your input. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, Director. It's my intention to go approximately another half an hour. Then we will break for the Prime Minister of Israel's address to the Congress on the floor, give you a chance for lunch, and then resume after that. But we'll keep pushing through for the next half hour if we can. Gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Wray. I think you have a little bit better tone in conversation, so I appreciate it, and answer some questions, so I appreciate it. Hopefully you'll answer also on 2 letters that I sent you over a year ago, one related to Durham report and the other one related to Russian infiltrated SBU that collaborated with FBI. So hopefully we'll get these answers and hopefully we'll start doing authorization. Don't you think doing authorization would help us to get better answers? Congress should be probably working authorizing new agency. Don't you agree with that?
We work very hard to try to get information to this committee and to other committees.
But authorizing spending probably would be a good thing for us to do. Don't you agree?
Oh, I'm sorry, authorizing what?
Our spending, not just doing appropriating, but actually doing authorization of spendings for this committee.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. We might start doing that. But we can talk about, and a lot of my colleagues on the other side, AR-15 gets a lot of bad rap, like to bring it up, this issue. But really, there are a lot of hunting rifles that probably, maybe even more accurate than a lot of ARs. And don't you agree, we have like millions, right? Don't you agree, we have millions of rifles owned by law-abiding Americans. So do you think we should be taking them millions of rifles from law-abiding Americans? What do you think about that? Would that be something feasible, and really we should be doing that?
Well, again, I'm not going to be addressing anybody's specific legislative proposal. From our perspective, from the FBI's perspective, the concern is any dangerous weapon in the wrong hands.
But all weapons
in the
are
hands
dangerous.
of the wrong person.
But all weapons are dangerous, right?
I'm sorry?
All weapons are dangerous. Knives are dangerous,
Sure.
explosive are dangerous. There are a lot of
weapons are by their very
but are we going to be
definition
confiscating, hunting rifles and rifles for millions of Americans? Do you think it's even feasible to do something like that from law-abiding citizens?
It's not something I'm advocating.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that. So we have to go back. That was a catastrophic failure of security. That's what's happened, recently with attempted assassination. Don't you agree with that?
Well, I think former Director Cheadle has already publicly acknowledged that it was, I think her words were, a significant operational failure.
Then we had, similar situation, a different, talking about bad optics. Speaker Pelosi at that time didn't want to have bad optics on January 6th, and we didn't have proper security here on January 6th. That was a catastrophic failure too. Are we looking at that? Any one conclusion was made from that? Have we made any adjustments? Because I know a lot of people, got hurt now just being here. It was a lot of cases bringing up the Department of Justice, and a lot of them were really just law-abiding Americans that really just upset with the government, and they have a reason to do it. So I think we need to think about it before we prosecute, or instead of actually, looking how we can deal with real criminals and how we can have a proper security when we have events with so many people there. So did you have confidential human sources? I think you never answered that question on January 6th in the Capitol. Did you have some?
I'm sorry, what's the question?
Confidential human sources. Did you have them on January 6th in the Capitol?
Well, again, I'm never going to be getting into when and where we
Okay,
have have not used confidential human sources. But
are you willing to stand the record that you had no confidential human sources that went into Capitol on January 6th?
As I've said consistently, I'm not going to get into where we have or have not used confidential human sources. I can tell you that if you are asking if the violence at the Capitol on January 6th was part of some operation orchestrated by FBI sources or agents, the answer is no.
No, I didn't ask you that. I asked you, so did you investigate any confidential human sources? Did you do any investigation and looking at that? So you're not answering if you had any or not. So if you had potentially, did you do anything you needed to make sure to investigate that none of your sources did anything wrong? If they did wrong, they were prosecuted the same way, like you're trying to prosecute a lot of people that really, even in Supreme Court ruled recently that some unconstitutional charges.
Let me just add that there have now been, I think, 180 individuals who've gone to trial, in addition to the 850 who've pled guilty.
Right, but I think the problem is you put these charges, a lot of people would plead guilty. But let me say just quickly, because I only have 10 seconds, really. So I hope you will take seriously what you're doing. Related to the border security is also a crisis. Your vice president was a lead-in on that. Has she initiated meetings with you to lead, like weekly or monthly meeting where she actually get briefings from you as a leading border czar that had that function? Have you had that? Has she initiated any meetings on a regular basis with you?
Again, the gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman can respond.
Right. On this issue of confidential human sources, number one, I will say there is a DOJ OIG review that's underway that I think addresses some of these kinds of topics, I believe, but I won't speak for the Inspector General. Second, as to this suggestion, which I've heard all too many times, that somehow January 6th was orchestrated by FBI agents or sources, I will note that in addition to my prior comments, that there have now been 850-ish individuals who've pled guilty, another 180 who've gone to trial. They've all had access to defense counsel, discovery, all the things the Constitution and the rules provide them. It's been in front of something like 15 different judges, I think dozens of juries, and not one has given credence to this notion. And in fact, I don't think any of them have even really seriously tried to raise it. So it's not just my word for it. Look what's happening in the cases. Thank you.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Wray, for being here, for your testimony today, for the work that you do each and every day, and that your frontline agents across the country do each and every day to protect Americans, to keep our country safe. Also grateful for the work that you're doing in investigating the horrific events of July 13th and the attempted assassination of former President Trump, which everyone must and has condemned. I would first just ask, do you believe that the FBI has the adequate resources to ultimately ensure that your agency gets to the bottom of it and fully investigates this terrible crime?
Well, we are devoting massive amounts of resources to this specific investigation. We have easily several hundred FBI agents, analysts, and professional staff working on it. It involves over half of the FBI's 56 field offices, almost every headquarters division. We even have some of our overseas offices working on it. You might say, well, why is that? Well, because some of the companies that involve accounts or purchases or communications or what have you that the shooter used are foreign companies, so we have to get evidence from overseas from those companies. I've talked about our lab a little bit earlier today. We've got our Office of Technology Division working on the digital devices. We have our Behavioral Analysis Unit, our BAU, working on helping us build out a profile of the shooter. I could go on and on and on. So it's all hands on deck on this case, as I think is appropriate. Now, when you ask about our resources, I've been public about the fact that the fiscal year 24 budget put us $500 million below where we needed to be to sustain current operations. And on FY25, the current House mark would put us significantly further back behind that and would result in significant risks across every program and our support to state and local law enforcement. We arrested something like 50 violent criminals per day, every day, last year. The current mark would mean more violent criminals on the street, more neighborhoods at risk. We have about a 1,300% increase in our investigations related to China and its targeting of us. And I can assure you, China's not cutting its budget. This would mean more threats from China. We have something like 300 to 400 investigations just into cartel leadership. And about hardly a week goes by when some FBI field office isn't seizing enough fentanyl to wipe out an entire state. Those cuts means more fentanyl on the street, more people dying. So the people who suffer the most are state and local law enforcement and the American people we're sworn to protect. And so look forward to working with Congress, but we really need to be smart about what we're doing, and I think that would be a step in the wrong direction given the threat environment that we face.
And I couldn't agree with you more, Director Wray, and of course we've talked about this during previous hearings in which you've testified, and to be clear that I think the budget that House Republicans have proposed, which is about a $325 million cut to the FBI, would do precisely what you've described and have deleterious impacts for public safety across our country, and House Democrats are certainly working to prevent those cuts from taking place. You've talked at great length about the events of July 13. There's justifiably a lot of public interest in the investigation, which we understand is ongoing. Wonder if there's anything that you'd like to disclose or provide to the committee or to the public that perhaps has not yet been gleaned during the course of this hearing, and just give you an opportunity, because there's a lot of folks related to the investigation. Yeah.
One thing I can give an update on, which is pretty fresh here. We had some conversations with some of the members about the access to the roof and the ladder and so forth. And our evidence response teams and their forensic collection, we now believe that the subject climbed onto the roof using some mechanical equipment on the ground and vertical piping on the side of the AGR building. In other words, we do not believe he used a ladder to get up there.
One question, if the chairman might indulge me with just a few extra seconds. There's an article recently regarding several former Trump administration national security officials who had received a duty to warn briefing from the FBI regarding the potential threat from Iran. And I think there is this article made clear deep concern that these individuals have, justifiably so, about the threat level, and particularly given the events of the last several months, and the need for there to be an increased security posture and security personnel for former officials who may very well still be at risk. And I don't know if you're familiar with that article. I'm trying not to use names here, but I think would perhaps follow up with your agency and with the Department of Justice more broadly to ensure that any individuals who are potentially facing a threat from Iran or another hostile actor in a foreign nation have the resources they need to have the security available to them.
So again, without reference to any specific individual, I want to be very clear about this because I've tried to be vocal on this, but it sometimes doesn't get noticed as much, which is that in my view, the Iranian government has been extremely aggressive and brazen. We have seen in the last few years an attempt, I'm speaking just from public information now, an attempt to assassinate a former U.S. National Security Advisor on U.S. soil. We have seen an attempt first to kidnap and then to try to murder an American dissident/journalist who was a critic of the Iranian regime right smack in the middle of New York City. We have seen a cyber attack against a children's hospital in New England that ties back to Iran. We have seen, as I've testified before, as Director Ratcliffe and I announced, an effort by the Iranians to target the 2020 presidential election. And that's all before you even get to the fact that the Iranian government is the leading state sponsor of terrorism. So if that's not enough to convince people that Iran is a threat, I don't know what is.
But Director, was there a distinction between what the gentleman from Colorado raised and what you just said, this general concern in these specific instances you talk about, and a direct specific threat on President Trump that's distinct from what you've been describing as this general concern with Iran?
Well, again, I can't get into specific pieces of class.
And if so, when? If it was a distinct threat on President Trump, when did that take place?
Yeah, all I can tell you, certainly in this kind of setting, is targeting of U.S. officials for the Soleimani strike is something that is a reality that the Iranian government has at times called for very publicly. And whenever there is reporting, let me try to answer your question this way. Whenever there is reporting about any of those protectees, we share the information in a variety of ways, working with the intelligence community, working with whoever is the protective service with responsibility for that individual, and we do it in a timely way using the duty to warn process that was just referred to. And to my knowledge, everything along those lines that's relevant was shared in a timely way with the relevant people.
Thank you. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Director Wray, thanks for being here. Where were you when you heard that President Trump was shot, and then what were like your immediate actions, response to that as director?
I was about to have dinner with family, and I was horrified and angry.
I'm just thinking, the reason I asked the question is because I'm still trying to figure out kind of lanes, what the FBI would respond to and what the Secret Service has the responsibility to respond to. Can you just kind of cover that again?
Sure. So the FBI is not responsible for, has never really been part of our mandate or mission for the physical security of venues, of specific protectees or anything like that. That's, if it's somebody within Secret Service's scope, that's their mandate and mission. We are a law enforcement and intelligence agency, and so if you think about it this way, we're the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We're not the Federal Bureau of Security. You might say, well, what's the difference? Well, there is a difference. We investigate crimes. We investigate threats to national security, but we don't. Questions about security posture, the adequacy of resources and assets that were deployed to protect a specific individual, whether there's enough security, and certainly the staffing of that security is not something the FBI, again, we're 116 years old, has historically done.
So at this point, have you been able to go through the shooter's home and kind of document kind of what you found as far as evidence goes?
So we have been able to search the shooter's home. So again, just sort of tying your first question to your second question now, our role is to conduct an investigation of the shooter and the attack. And so we're going to conduct a painstaking, intense investigation of that. We have, among other scenes that we've processed using evidence response teams, in addition to the rally scene itself, of course, we have been through the shooter's home, his bedroom, other parts of the house, et cetera.
Have you been able to establish that he did go to a range and either zero that weapon in or, at least target shoot that weapon prior to the assassination attempt?
So we do assess that he went to a shooting range the day before, not the only time he went to a shooting range. He was a fairly, avid might be a little strong, but a fairly avid, shooting hobbyist. And so he went to, belonged to different sort of clubs and went to certain ranges and that kind of thing. We do believe, based on what we've seen so far, that he went to a shooting range the day before and that he shot an AR-style rifle at that range the day before. I'm not sure we know for sure that it's the weapon that he used, but I think we assess that it probably is.
Have you been able to interview his parents?
Yes, we have.
And was there anything that was gained from that interview that would lead you to believe that they certainly were aware of what was going on?
I guess I want to be careful about talking about specific people's interviews, but I would say that his parents were cooperative with us. And as I've said before, and hopefully this gets at your question, we have not identified any accomplices, co-conspirators, or anything along those lines.
So it's the FBI's position right now that he still acted independently.
Again, we're still, I know it seems like a lifetime since July 13th, but we're still early stages. But we have not seen anything so far that would suggest to us that he acted with others.
How does the FBI view not just a Trump rally, but political rallies versus other types of events, from a security perspective, compared to a college football game or any mass, large crowd type gathering? Because I think one of the things that's most difficult to really to swallow at this point is that the idea that these Trump rallies have been happening for years and that there could be such a lax approach to the physical security of those fairgrounds that day. And I'm wondering, where does this fall? And then on top of that there were other presidential candidates out there that didn't have full Secret Service protection. RFK Jr. has been the most vocal about it. I was wondering if you could comment on the facilities as well as providing security for presidential candidates.
Well, again, I want to be a little bit careful to stay in my lane because, again, security posture and the adequacy of the security posture is really the core expertise and responsibility of agencies like the Secret Service. But certainly it is, I think, fair to say that outdoor events, whether they're political rallies or, as you say, a college football game in an open stadium, a concert, these are places that are often, particularly challenging to secure adequately because the range of threats that can face them are higher. In addition to that, as has been discussed a little bit here already in today's hearing, just threats to public officials, including politicians, is an increasingly pervasive part of today's landscape. And so that adds to the challenge. So you're talking about the combination of individuals who are increasingly targeted for violence, combined with venues that are softer and harder to secure targets, I guess is the way I would answer. But again, those kinds of questions, the adequacy of the security posture, all the resources that were or were not devoted, all that stuff, is my understanding, would be very much in scope for the DHS Inspector General investigation and this outside independent panel that's been appointed.
I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Director, I think we're going to be able to get 2 more members' times of question, then we have to get to the floor for the Prime Minister. Gentlelady from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Chair Johnson, and thank you so much, Director Wray, for your transparency and your testimony today. First, I want to say my friend, and she was my friend before I even came to Congress. And in my freshman year, she kind of took me under her wing and she kind of showed me the ropes. And she was a force to be reckoned with. And I can say that she will never, ever be replaced. And she was a trailblazer, and I know that she will sorely be missed here in Congress. Director Wray, I only have one question for you today, but before we get to that point, I'd just like to reiterate today that political violence is never acceptable. Regardless of how different our political values and views are, attempted assassinations are a stain to the very democratic ideals of this nation. We have endured riots on Capitol Hill on January 6th, where a literal noose was erected on Capitol grounds, intended for then Vice President Pence and Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi. Political violence against election workers, that has been expressed today. An attack on Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's husband. Threats against the FBI agents, as you have expressed, and prosecutors, and threats to the staff who serve the public every single day. Congressman Connolly's staff was targeted and attacked last year. And now we have the attempted assassination of a former president of the United States. All of this within just the last 3 years. This violence simply needs to end. The assassination attempt on Donald Trump was, by the grace of God, a failure. The weapon the 20-year-old man was able to obtain, an AR-15, generally has a shooting range up to 600 yards and shot Mr. Trump from almost 150 yards away. This weapon has the ability to kill multiple people in seconds. And sadly, Corey Compouture lost his life because of this man and because of this gun. Mr. Compouture's family will never be the same. Trust me, I understand that more than anyone else in this room. Is the near loss of a former president enough for this Congress to finally take action? Because there are 206 of us that are already standing in the wings, ready to take immediate action to ban assault weapons today. We need only 12 more of our colleagues to join us in courage and move the legislation to save lives of so many of the people that we are elected to serve by removing assault weapons from the hands of people who simply should not have them in their possession. We are crippling our democracy, and we are ripping apart our fellow Americans until we do. I ask today, because it is clearly it wasn't enough to take action when the lethality of assault weapons, we lost 26 and 7-year-olds and 6 teachers in 2012, when I also lost my son to gun violence, or 14 teenagers and 3 more teachers in 2018, nor was it enough when we lost 19 more children and 2 more teachers in 2022. Well, is it enough now? Now that a former president, the very president that many of you in this room are hoping will be reelected, almost lost his life because this Congress has failed to reinstate an assault weapons ban. A ban that, by the way, Republicans joined with Democrats the past 30 years ago. Well, fine. If y'all don't like assault weapons ban, we can bring another bill that I have introduced to a vote, the Go Safe Act. This bill focuses on the components of the semi-automatic firearms and regulates their infrastructure, sale, and transfer. This, again, is not the time for thoughts and prayers. This is a time for action. Director Wray, just one question I have for you. Would you rather have your officers protected or protect someone against an assault weapon being shot from 147 yards away or standard pistol with no accessories attached?
Well, again, I'm going to refrain from appearing to comment on specific legislative proposals, but I can tell you that we have certainly concerned about the danger to law enforcement from any kind of high-powered weapon in the wrong hands. And it hits close to home for us because just not that long ago, two great agents, Laura Schwarzenberger and Dan Alphen, down in Miami, executing a search in a crimes against children case, were shot and killed by a subject with an automatic weapon. So again, dangerous weapons in the wrong hands is something that, of course, from a law enforcement perspective concerns us, but I'm not going to wade into the legislative process.
Well, thank you for that answer. I'd rather give our agents a fighting chance, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Wray, for being here today. So we spend $3 billion a year, excuse me, on the Secret Service, $3 billion. And it would seem that we could and should have had a better job done a few weeks ago on the 13th than what we saw. Will you have anything to say about correcting what are the obvious deficiencies in what the Secret Service did?
Well, for the most part, the deficiencies or adequacy or inadequacy of Secret Service's performance, decision-making, resources, all that stuff is in the purview of those two other investigations. That is the DHS Inspector General and the outside independent panel that's been announced. Having said that, our investigation, which, as I've testified now, involves several hundred FBI employees and every asset we can bring to bear, of the shooter, again, our investigations of the shooter and his attack, of course, involves interviewing law enforcement, including lots and lots and lots of Secret Service people. So we'll share all that with those reviews so that they can answer those questions.
The reason I'm asking this is because this isn't the first time the Secret Service has been before Congress. There was a 435-page report issued in 2015 by Congress saying, fix yourself. They didn't. In fact, there was a follow-up in 2019 where they had only done a few of the, I think it was 18 or 19 different specific things they were supposed to do. They'd done some, but certainly not all. There was another follow-up in 2022, and again, the Secret Service had not done what Congress had asked. I guess my question to you, Mr. Director, is what should Congress do? A 435-page report 9 years ago, and still the Secret Service didn't do what it was told to do then. Can you help, Director Wray? Because this type of performance is not acceptable.
Well, I think even former Director Cheadle has acknowledged that this was a significant operational failure. If there are ways for the FBI to be helpful beyond what we're already doing in terms of our investigation, we stand ready to try to be helpful. I do want to say, as somebody who's been in law enforcement for most of my career, I've worked with some just phenomenal Secret Service agents. Going all the way back to my time as a line prosecutor, and they have an incredibly hard job, and I have a lot of affection and respect for the men and women of the Secret Service.
I'm sure you do, and I'm sure you're right. But the trouble is, when Congress says you need to do these 19 things and they don't, something needs to change. Now, the director has resigned, but you're going to be in a position, because your agency is doing such a careful review, to say a lot about what should have been done. I guess the real issue is much more of what the higher-ups in that agency are or are not doing. Perhaps that's on us.
And we will share with those reviews anything that we come across that could be helpful or relevant to them for those questions.
Let me quickly go to some details on the actual events. It appeared to a lot of us, as the Secret Service was taking former President Trump from the stage, that he was clearly still in view of everybody. And had there been another shooter, I didn't see him being protected. Are you going to raise that issue?
I think that's really more in scope of these two other reviews, both of them.
Okay, that's fine. Let me go to the shooter as he was on top of the roof. Apparently another officer from another police division saw him and quickly ducked down because the shooter aimed a gun at him. And then the shooter apparently, was he prone at the time he took the shot toward the president?
So my understanding is that the local officer who that we're talking about, with the assistance of another local officer, was able to kind of get up and see onto the roof where he observed the shooter, I believe, in a prone shooting position. The shooter then turned and faced him, the local officer, with the weapon.
From the prone position.
That's my understanding.
And then he went back to the prone position.
And this is all seconds before the shooter took his...
But that entire time, the shooter was in the scope sight of the counter sniper, correct?
That one I'd have to double check on. I know we've interviewed the counter sniper, but I'm not sure I know the answer.
The counter sniper didn't take a shot until after the assassin attempted to shoot the former president and others. He got off 8 shots before the counter sniper shot the shooter. What's with that protocol? Can you get that fixed?
Well, I really want to be careful not to be, given the scope of our investigation, somehow second-guessing the very difficult act and decision it takes for a counter sniper to kill another human being in that situation. It's all happening in seconds. So
8 shots.
Yeah.
And that was after he'd been seen for 20 minutes. I yield back. Thank you.
Director, that's an important question, though, because you've talked to the counter sniper. And that, I mentioned this in our opening statement, that critical 5 minutes from 6:09 to 6:14 and what takes place there is critical. And I think that's what the gentleman was getting at. And we were hopeful that you could tell us something about your interview with the counter sniper.
Yeah, I guess I want to distinguish a couple things. There is some individual, not law enforcement, I believe, who spotted the shooter on the roof a few minutes before. But I think law enforcement spotting him with the weapon on the roof is seconds before the shot.
Okay,
So
that's important.
yeah, so I think there's two different things
I think
going
what you're
on
saying
there.
is it wasn't maybe that if the bad guy shoots at 6:11, then you're saying this encounter with local law enforcement that Mr. Bentz was just getting into happened just seconds before that and maybe not 2 minutes before that?
That's my understanding. That, in other words, that there's different things here. There's an individual, at least one individual I can think of, not law enforcement, member of the public, who observed him on the roof. Not clear to whether or not the individual saw a weapon or not, but saw him in a way that was concerning. That is some number of, not many, but like just a handful of minutes. I think separate from that, as far as law enforcement goes, in terms of a weapon, this local officer that we just talked about observed the individual, again, literally just seconds before the shooter took his shots. Separate and apart from all of that, roughly, I think, maybe a little less than or around an hour before the shooting, there were local law enforcement officers who observed the shooter, not up on the roof, not with a weapon, but with I believe, a rangefinder, kind of like you would use if you were playing golf or something, in a way that was odd and suspicious. So that started happening with local law enforcement beforehand. But in terms of shooter, meaning with the weapon, law enforcement, my understanding is that the first time that happened was this local officer climbing up on the roof seconds before the shooting.
Again, we want that timeline. I think the committee wants that timeline and communications that were taking place in that short period of time.
Again, as I've said with everything else, I really want to be careful. I'm leaning in, trying to share as much as I can here. Facts are evolving, things may change, but we are working on a timeline, among other things.
Committee will stand in recess until after the Prime Minister's remarks conclude. Committee will come to order. The gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you so much, Director Wray, for being with us yet again. As you know, we've seen a disturbing rise in domestic terrorism and far-right extremism across the United States, and we've heard from you several times about this. White supremacist and far-right extremist groups continue to outpace all types of terrorism and domestic violent extremism, according to the National Institute of Justice report from this past January. Part of this dramatic rise in extremist violence and threats stems from malign foreign actors who are actively working to sow division in American democracy. They're desperately trying to inflame extremists and deepen divides, all to support far-right agendas and candidates that will erode our democracy. The DHS threat assessment has warned we expect the 2024 election cycle will be a key event for possible violence and foreign influence targeting our election infrastructure, processes, and personnel. Microsoft has warned that the 2024 election may be the first presidential election during which multiple authoritarian actors simultaneously attempt to interfere with and influence election outcomes. National security officials and experts have warned that foreign governments, mainly Russia, China, and Iran, seek to destabilize the United States via its elections by sowing further division in the American electorate. This is happening in the current context of increased political violence in our country against a former president, election workers, judges, members of Congress and their families, and other public servants. I cannot emphasize enough that this is a national security threat. Director Wray, reports have found that these propaganda campaigns will sometimes target racial groups. Why would countries like Russia, China, Iran seek to inflame racial tensions via social media?
Well, of course, it may vary from adversary to adversary, but the playbook for authoritarian regimes in today's world is to try to sow divisiveness and discord, to turn us against each other, to capitalize on existing social tensions that they perceive, and to try to, in effect, pour gasoline on the fire and intensify those conflicts that may already exist in our domestic, political scene. So rather than, if you're a foreign adversary that means us no good, rather than try to come up with some completely brand new issue or theory or narrative to turn us against each other, you look for things where we're already, at the very least, quarreling with each other, if not fighting with each other, and then they try to capitalize on that and amp it up. And of course, that can then sometimes, as we've seen all too tragically, boil over or bubble over into outright violence.
And so how has the FBI worked to combat this propaganda and infiltration on our social media networks?
So our focus is on the foreign actor, China, Russia, Iran, and on their efforts. And so we work with the intelligence community, we work with our foreign partners, our friendly foreign partners, to try to uncover what those countries, Russia, China, Iran, are up to. And we try to share information about the hidden hand of the foreign actor where it's appropriate. We also engage in efforts to disrupt those foreign actors. The most recent example with the Russians, for example, is a Russian government-linked generative AI social media bot farm where they were posing as, among others, U.S. persons and not, in fact, U.S. persons, and trying to, again, sow various narratives. In that case, very heavily focused on the issue they picked there was, the war in Ukraine, and again, trying to kind of get everybody turned against each other. We've also seen that, though, from China and Iran. I mentioned China before. We've had a case where we charged, I think it was 34 Chinese Ministry of Public Security, MPS officers, for much the same kind of behavior, creating false personas, pretending to be Americans, and then trying to kind of sow narratives. In that case, in the Chinese case, their narratives were trying to, for example, undermine any suggestion that COVID was the product of a lab leak, or attacking U.S. law enforcement at the anniversary of George Floyd's death, for example. And then Iran, in 2020, we saw them undertake similar kinds of efforts that were disrupted in the I think, October of 2020.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Director Wray, thank you for being here, and thank you for the information that you've provided today. I greatly appreciate it. This event that occurred the attempted assassination of President Trump on July 13th in Butler, Pennsylvania was a level 5 alarm alert to this country that our elected officials, our leaders, the president, the former president, are not safe, and we need to reevaluate from the ground up exactly how we are to go about providing that protection. The information you provided dealing with 8 cartridges from the roof, the drone, the fact that 2 explosive devices were found in the car, 1 at home. That was a remote detonation device that he had on him. The fact that his phone was using encrypted platforms. He only had 1 phone, correct?
Oh, sorry. He had 1 phone, although we've identified other phones that he may have used that may not have been his phone. So, for example, we think in certain instances he might have used his dad's phone. Again, not necessarily related to the attack, but we're trying to make sure that we process and exploit every device he could have used. And we keep, which is part of why I keep making this point, which I know you all are probably tired of me making about this being an ongoing investigation, because we keep identifying new pieces of equipment, new accounts, what have you.
And the fact that you are in real time informing us about what you're finding as you're performing this investigation is very helpful, and clarifying the fact that he went to the range a day before and shot an AR. Now, my understanding is that the AR he used on the 13th was his father's. Is that correct?
Well, yes and no. It was originally, his father bought it legally, but then our understanding so far is that his father then conveyed it to him, sold it, in fact, to his son. So originally his father's, at the time of the shooting, the shooter's.
Okay, so that's new information. Was that provided to you by the father?
I think it was partly from that. I think we also saw some documentation to support it.
Okay. Investigators also have said that the shooter posted, quote, July 13th will be my premiere, watch it as it unfolds, on an online gaming platform sometime before he tried to assassinate President Trump. Can you confirm that, and how much time elapsed between this posting and the attempt on July 13th?
So I'm really glad you asked about that, because that is a situation where, again, in our effort to give real-time information, since we've provided that information, we have since learned that July 13th premiere, profile page on the gaming platform, it turns out it was not the shooter.
Okay.
That it was some other individual as part of some sick joke who, after the shooting, created a profile page pretending to be the shooter.
Wow.
And so, of course, that person is now admitted to it, and but anyway, my point being, among the other challenges that we as investigators have, you have people who create accounts in today's world, create accounts pretending to be somebody that they're, and it's not the actual person.
Now the
so
shooter,
that's troubling, obviously, and it makes our jobs even harder as investigators.
Thank you for clarifying that. Did he have an online gaming account?
We do believe he was a gamer, and that he had different kinds of gaming accounts. So that's part of why
Any information gleaned from those?
Not yet, but again, some of those legal process returns I'm still waiting on.
Now, during the attempted assassination, Crooks was wearing a T-shirt from a popular YouTube channel. Have you been able to access his selection of YouTube videos that he's watched?
I believe we have seen some of his search history, but I think we've got a ways to go on that. I know there's some manual work that we're doing on that. I think the most notable thing that we've found recently, which I don't think has been shared until today, is that on a laptop that the investigation ties to him, that on July 6th, it revealed a Google search, and his search, if it was him, again, it's a laptop tied to him. We obviously believe it's him, but we'll continue to investigate. But his Google search was, how far away was Oswald from Kennedy?
Right.
And
horrifying.
Yes, absolutely.
Can you clarify that you have in your possession all the video that was taken on that day at the scene?
We've collected mountains of video. Part of the reason
you commit to providing us with that video?
Well, we're going to work with the committee and share information as best we can. Part of the reason I hedged on whether we have it all is, as you can appreciate, in today's world, everybody with a phone has the ability to take footage, and so we're finding things kind of left and right.
You have all the law enforcement video.
I believe we have all the law enforcement video, but we're still collecting evidence.
Okay. And I hope you would provide that to us and to the American people. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Director, just to be clear, the photo and the message on the online gaming account, I think your testimony was to Mr. Klein that was somebody else posing as the shooter. Is that right?
Correct. Somebody after July 13th created this profile, pretending to be the shooter, and sent us down a rabbit trail, which we've now tied off.
That's important information. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Wray, for being here. And I want to add my voice to the chorus of folks who are just devastated by the illness and passing of Sheila Jackson Lee. What a champion. What a role model. I always called her the hardest working member of Congress. She was everywhere on every issue. She'll be greatly missed. Director Wray, I thank you for what you said earlier, which is leaning in. This is such an extraordinary set of events. The attempted assassination of Donald Trump, the stealing of the life of a father, a firefighter, somebody who protected lives, Corey Comparator, serious injuries to 2 others. So I thank you because you are trying to give us what you can without jeopardizing the investigation, and I think that's very helpful. Did the shooter also investigate other high-profile folks? We had heard some reporting around that early on.
Well, you say investigate other folks. I think this is a place where we still have a lot more work to do. Part of what we did find was a bunch of cached images of a variety of public figures. But again, cached images are those images that you get when you pull up a news story from any number of news sites. If there are photographs in the article, those images are automatically put into the cache on your computer. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you were searching for that person's image. We do have the fact that starting around, at the least around the period early July, so the search that I just mentioned related to Oswald and Kennedy, that's about July 6th, which is the same day we believe that he registered for the rally. And the day before, he traveled to the grounds for the first time. And so I think there is a certain amount of searches related to former President Trump that during that period we're seeing, consistent with some kind of planning or reconnaissance, if you want to call it that, in advance of the rally. But that's sort of confined to that, or concentrated, maybe is a better word, in that July period, after the announcement of the rally and before the shooting.
Can you speak to the conveyance of the gun? So this is a 20-year-old young man. His father owned the gun originally, AR-15, am I correct?
AR style, yeah.
AR style. 20-year-old man. When did the father sell the gun to him? And what documents do you have? How much money transpired? What date was it?
Yeah, I do know that, I know, we believe, based on what we've seen, that his father, after purchasing the gun legally, sold the gun to his son. I don't know that I have the date of that transfer or the amount of the transfer, although we may be able to get that to you as a file. I just don't have it in front of me.
Do you know when the father bought it?
We know. I don't, as I'm sitting here testifying in front of you, I don't have that in front of me, so I don't have it at my fingertips.
I'm just wondering if it's proximate to this event.
I do not believe that the gun was purchased, that is the gun that was used. I do not believe it was purchased particularly close in time to the shooting, but how far in advance? It may have been a year before, give or take, but again, we'll go back and double check that on you. I do know that on the day of the shooting, at about 1:30 p.m., he bought 50 rounds of ammunition. So if you think about the day of, or if you back up a little bit, so the day before he goes to the shooting range, the day of he goes to the grounds the morning of the event for, I think, around an hour. He buys the ammunition at around 1:30. At around 3:50 is when he's back on the grounds of the rally, and that's when he used the drone that I've talked about already today. And then, of course, fast forward till just after 6 o'clock when the worst happened.
And we had thought maybe over the weekend there was a conversation around a classified briefing for members. I hope that will happen as soon as it's feasible for you and for the other agencies involved. And he got off 8 shots, and the reporting is that that was in under 6 seconds. He got off 8 shots, fatal to one. My question that I'll leave you with, and I know I'm over time, Mr. Chairman, is we all decry political violence. We decry any violence, but we decry the rise in political violence. What can you tell us that we could do better? What do you need for you to be able to help this country reduce the political violence tendencies?
I think this is a moment where, in the most stark way possible, all of us as Americans can see how out of control political violence is in this country. And it's an opportunity for everybody to come together and to try to show that this is not the kind of thing we're going to tolerate in this country. The FBI's role is to focus on violence and threats of violence. But there is a role for others in the public square to address how people communicate in this country. And every day in our jobs, we see in social media, in terms of threats that we get, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of tips reported to us, and the language that's out there is just mind-bogglingly hateful and violent sounding. People sometimes, as figures of speech, use expressions that are very violent expressions, and so that is a part of it. We can all do better in kind of being a little more thoughtful and measured in our language. But again, the FBI's, we got to stay in our lane. Our lane is the violence and the threats of violence. There's a role for everybody as Americans to try to see if we can take the temperature down.
Great, thank you. And thank you for the extra time. I yield back.
Gentleman from North Dakota is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I really appreciate you correcting the gaming thing about this is my coming out party, because we're asking you to do something, and we've had acrimonious, you and I have actually had acrimonious, but we're not here for a got you moment. We're just not on this. And we're asking you to give us information before the investigation is complete. My only recommendation or suggestion would be when that happens, don't necessarily wait till you ask, because don't wait for us to ask. Because and I'll go through why in a second. I appreciate you coming in. I appreciate you telling us things. I appreciate you guys going against essentially your normal policy of waiting until an investigation is done, because the American people need to know it. But here's why. There's a guy with a rangefinder walking around that everybody noticed and then couldn't find. He's scaled to the top of a roof within 150 yards line of sight to the president or Republican former presidential candidate by climbing a drain pipe, and then you said some equipment. He was being pointed out by rally goers everywhere they could, and nobody could figure it out. There's maybe supposed to be local law enforcement in the building, either upstairs or downstairs, and all of this is going on. And I was talking to a colleague of mine yesterday on the floor, and it's like, I hate the conspiracy theories that come out, but this is not the FBI's purview. This is the Secret Service's purview. This is so comically inept to the average North Dakota citizen. Is just, they look at this and they're like, how could this possibly happen? And so by you giving us information in a really meaningful way, even though we know the investigation's ongoing and things can change, that at least helps us to deal with that and figure out where we're at. And so, I mean, and you're doing all this. This guy had no combat training, no counter surveillance training that you're aware of, right?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear
He
that.
had no combat training.
Oh, no, I don't think any, certainly no what we would call, what you and I would call combat training. Obviously, he was a fairly active recreational shooter, so he did plenty of shooting.
A lot of guys.
No, I don't think any, certainly no what we would call, what you and I would call combat training. Obviously, he was a fairly active recreational shooter, so he did plenty of shooting.
A lot of guys in
right.
Western
Yeah.
North Dakota, right? I mean, all of those different things. And somehow we came within under of an inch of a presidential candidate being shot and killed within 100 days out from an election. And when you look at it, so I just want to be really clear, because there is a lot of this. There is no evidence of another shooter, right?
I mean, another shooter.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the counter sniper who took out the shooter.
Well,
right. But you're talking about like another.
Anybody else. And you're looking at his online and seeing all that, but there's no evidence he had any other accomplices on scene that day, correct?
Correct. Not that we've seen yet, certainly.
And you said, and Oversight's had a hearing, DHS had a hearing, we're having a hearing now. The Inspector General's going to investigate. We're probably announcing a bipartisan outside panel. But there's another investigation too, right? Because somebody has to clear the shooter. Like, even though it is a Secret Service officer deploying his, I mean, when an FBI agent kills somebody in the line of duty, what's the process?
So we have what we call an agent-involved shooting, is I think what you're getting at. And we have a whole process.
Usually get put on leave, paid leave, get a lawyer, depending on how it is, right?
Some of those things depend, but we have, our inspection division does a shoot review of each time when there's one of these situations. And they sometimes have to coordinate with local prosecutors who are also doing some kind of review. But so yes, Secret Service would have a similar kind of process for the counter.
I mean, because you have to actually establish one of the defenses to homicide. Just like, I mean, you don't do it in a court system the same way everybody else does, but you have to justify that shooting was justified. So when the FBI does that, do they conduct that all internally?
Most of the time, yes. Every once in a while, there's a situation where the Inspector General gets involved.
Do you know how the Secret Service does it?
I don't.
Okay. And I just think that's important, because when we're talking about how this works, and I don't think anybody is arguing it wasn't, anybody who's seen it knows what happens, but it's just knowing it and making sure that the process is handled correctly. And I just want to shift gears with my last 30 seconds really quickly, because we had a hearing on the northern border in Grand Forks, and you were talking about specific threats from Iran, but also generally. And we've diverted an exceptional amount of resources to the southern border. Our interactions, 114% increase in apprehensions. And the one specific thing, with all due respect to my friends and my neighbors from Canada, it's a lot easier to get into Canada for some of these countries where we have these real issues with terrorist threats than it is to the United States, particularly Iran. And are you guys monitoring that and making sure whatever coordination you have with Canada that we're paying attention to that as well?
We have an excellent relationship, we the FBI, with our Canadian counterparts, both RCMP, the Mounties, as some people euphemistically call them, and CSIS, they're my intelligence service counterparts. We have great relationships with them, and terrorism is, I find, probably the #1 thing we talk about.
Yeah, they're understaffed and overworked on the northern border, and they can use all the help you get. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, thank you for today. I think I greatly appreciate your candor. I know it's highly unusual to go into this level of detail during an active investigation, and I know it's a special and unique circumstance given the nature of what happened that day. I'll ask my colleagues that we not try and take advantage of this in other circumstances. I think we need to be careful about pressuring our investigators, to disclose information in the middle of an investigation in a casual or routine way. But thank you for what you've done here today. I do want to mention this too. Like Congressman Correa, I went up to Butler with Homeland Security Committee, and had a chance to meet with a number of the people there, including people who were there at the rally. And, you know, several of them were elected officials. In fact, one of them that spoke with me a lot was sitting directly behind Mr. Trump when he was shot, and she had video that she'd taken, and she'd love to share it with you all. But she mentioned a couple of things, too, that I hope you all will have a chance to have conversations about. And I know some of it's going to be in the Secret Service lane, some's going to be in the FBI lane. But one of the things she talked about was the fact that the day before the shooting, she and other officials in the town and people who just wanted to prepare the stage showed up and started working on putting the bunting up and decorating it. But the point she noted was that none of them had been vetted. There was nobody there to keep an eye on them and make sure that, you know, everything that was being done was appropriate. And she actually sort of thought in this in the context of hearing that a gun was found, or a gun was perhaps hidden at the site before the shooter was able to get it and use it. I don't know those details, but those are some of the things that came up that day. She also mentioned that there was sort of the outer perimeter. So you had a perimeter around the stage that the Secret Service had set up. Beyond that, you had a field, and then you had the building where the company was, and the shooter got on the roof. Apparently, there was a sort of a second level of a perimeter there that wasn't particularly restricted from an access standpoint, as with the street that was just beyond that. So she raised, and another elected official raised as well, issues about security that may actually kind of get into what you're talking about, whether the ladder was there, how the guy got on the roof. There are all sorts of issues with respect to that. And there was a lot of people, as you said, that had videotape. I talked to 3 that were showing me videos while I was standing out there in the grounds. But I had a couple of questions to ask of you briefly. Apparently, there was no Secret Service recordation of communications during that day. You know, there's no radio runs, we call them, but there's no tapes. Do you know if there are any recorded conversations among law enforcement from that day?
I don't know the details of that. I believe there may be some, but I don't have in front of me exactly what we've seen or heard.
Okay. And then with respect to email communications, there were a lot of issues about, you know, because my personal view, having gone to the site, was that they just shouldn't have had the rally there. It should not have been permitted. I thought there were just too many roofs. You know, he picked one, but there was like a half dozen others that he could have picked on the other side of the field. And as Eli Crane, a congressman who was a sniper for the U.S. military, said, there was a water tower that actually would have been a better site, probably that Secret Service should have used, but could have been used as well. But had the lead up to that decision, and Congressman Correa raised this, who made this decision about how to pick the site? And apparently there was back and forth between local law enforcement, Secret Service, and the campaign. And I was kind of curious as to whether that's something that your investigation is going into or not.
So I think that primarily falls within the scope of the 2 other reviews, that is the DHS Inspector General review and the outside panel, independent panel that's been announced. Certainly we are interviewing law enforcement personnel, but the security preparations, the adequacy of the security preparations.
That's the other lane?
That's the other lane.
All right, I only got 15 seconds left. Quick question for you with probably not a quick answer, but this scenario is kind of the worst case scenario from a couple of standpoints. Got a lone wolf shooter with no red flags that we've heard of so far. You know, nobody should have known that this was coming. He didn't have a criminal record and that sort of thing. Easy access to an assault weapon. I had a discussion like this with, I think, Congressman Roy and Congressman Bishop several months ago. What is it we can do to try and preempt those kinds of scenarios? We've got gun violence all over the country, including in my district. This is one example, but, you know, this scenario is the worst possible that I can think of from the standpoint of no intervention prevention efforts that can be put in place to try and address it. But I'm kind of curious if you have any thoughts to the contrary on that.
I don't know that I have any magic solution to the problem. And I certainly don't want to be proposing, you know, legislative ideas. That's not really my role. Certainly, dangerous weapons, especially high-powered weapons, in the hands of the wrong person represent a real concern for law enforcement, including to law enforcement, sometimes as the victims, as we saw very tragically down near Miami with 2 of our agents killed. But that's probably all I can say on that. I do, while we're on the subject of firearms, Mr. Chairman, I have an answer to Congresswoman Dean's question. I might as well give it now, which is about the purchase of the firearm. I'm told that the father purchased the firearm in 2013, so quite a while ago, and then he sold it to his son in October of 2023.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back, and thank you, Mr. Director, for your great work.
I'd ask unanimous consent that we enter into the record a statement from Representative Kelly and some questions for the Bureau. Representative Kelly represents Butler. Actually, that's his hometown. So without objection, those will be entered into the record, and we'll make sure you get those, Director. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin, and this is not directly with you, actually, I just wanted to straighten something out. I know my colleagues, the gentlemen and the gentleladies from Georgia, Washington, California, Pennsylvania, they all mentioned Project 2025. Well, I don't know how they expect you to know about that, number one. I'm pretty damn involved. I don't really know a whole lot about it. But President Trump has made it clear, and we're going to say it again, we'll say it over and over again, that there are some things he disagreed with, some things he agreed with that he wasn't that familiar with. It was from the Heritage Foundation. And that was just raw politics, to be honest with you. It was just because 2025 has some things in it that they believe are really going to offend American people, and it very well may. And so they want to pin it on the presidential candidate. He didn't author it. He didn't condone it. He didn't put his seal of approval on it. It's getting old. It really is. We do this with other things. Just like in this committee, when anything goes wrong, anything, somehow Donald Trump's name has to be brought into it, and it gets tiring. It's politics over reality. Second thing about picking the site, I was intimately involved in the Wildwood rally, the biggest rally President Trump's ever had, biggest political rally in the state of New Jersey. I had spoken to the president about it, and he wanted to do it on the beach because we had over 100,000 people. And let me tell you, we had everybody out there because they were concerned, the Secret Service and the local police and the county police, and just about every entity could be. And so they had, behind it was that iconic setting. They had the Ferris wheels on the pier and all the stuff. They had agents up in there. They had agents in the ocean, in the water, in boats. They had people coordinating, working with each other and talking with each other because they knew it was a risk. So we chose a site that was difficult. The president did, and I thought it was a great site. But nevertheless, the law enforcement responded properly. Something went wrong here. You can't blame this on Donald Trump as well. The site was chosen. It's the responsibility of those who serve in law enforcement to make sure that he was safe, period. And I'm sure you'll find out why. On another tangent here, you know, I've got to wonder how many qualified people were passed in order for Director Cheadle to get her 30% quota. That's a lousy way to run an agency, especially when it's dealing with law enforcement, to say we've got to have 30% of anything. And I worry about these practices because it's policy over protection. And Director Wray, I know that some things were left to you. I understand that. But one of your early acts on the Biden presidency was hiring the FBI's very first chief diversity officer. And since that time, and even before your time, and you're going to disagree with me, but respectfully, I'm going to disagree with you. Recruitment standards under your lead has resulted in deterioration in many areas, including physical fitness, illicit drug use, financial irregularities, mental health issues, full-time work experience, and integrity. And I know you dismissed them, but in October 2023, they are a prestigious group of retired FBI special agents and analysts both expressed concern regarding the FBI's willingness to recruit agents that, quote, I'm not saying this, they said it, not me, can't even pass the new relaxed standards for fitness, who are illiterate in some cases and need lessons educational lessons, don't want to work weekends or after hours, their words, and have serious disabilities or mental health issues, which is not the place for them. Most of your agents are great people. I love them. I love them for what they do. I'm not criticizing most. But these new standards, don't you think this is a hindrance and reduces the morale of the vast majority of good people that you have in the FBI? And I ask you for a quick answer because I have a few other things.
So I respect our retired agents. That many of them come to our graduations now, and I can tell you emphatically that they are mistaken. Those who think that we have lowered our standards, whether it's on physical fitness or anything else, are mistaken.
And you can prove that.
The facts back me up on that.
The standards are the same today as they were a decade ago.
I'll give you
they've changed in some ways that are appropriate.
In fact, the physical fitness standards, depends on how far back you go, but the physical fitness standards that our current graduates have to graduate from Quantico actually exceed some of the physical fitness standards that were in place if you go back far enough with some of our retirees. But what I would tell you, I think part of the reason there's confusion, and again, I accept that these folks are raising their concerns in good faith, but we have actually access to the facts. And part of the reason I think there's confusion, just take the physical fitness thing as an example, is that before you had to pass the physical fitness test before you showed up to Quantico. Now you have to pass it in order to get a badge at Quantico. The standard hasn't changed. You still have to pass the same test, the same 12-point standard, et cetera. All that stuff applies. The only difference is you can pass it while you're at Quantico. But if you don't pass that same test that's been in place for a long time now, you don't get a badge. And we will dismiss people from Quantico, and we do, who don't pass that
Director, I know
test.
I have to wrap this up, and I appreciate that. If you could get us information that substantiates what you say, that should be easy enough to do to the whole committee. I'd appreciate it. You know, feelings in this administration are more important than functionality. It's resulted in a border crisis. We don't have time to talk about that. You've spoken out about it. I appreciate that you've spoken out about it. I think it's also resulted in shortages in our nation's law enforcement and our military, and I think it makes us less safe. So I look forward to seeing those statistics and that proof, because I have people talking in my ear that tell me otherwise, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Wray, I appreciate you being here today, and I certainly appreciate your forthcomingness and giving us information that I think that the American people want. And, you know, to me, you have a very difficult job right now. In the past, and under Comey, certainly, the Russian collusion narrative got out pretty heavily, and that came out of the FBI with the FISA warrants and that sort of stuff, spying on General Flynn. And then the laptop issue, the Hunter Biden laptop issue, which the FBI actually had in their possession. So I have 800,000 people thereabouts that I represent, and our job is to restore trust. And so in a lot of the hearings we've had this week, they say, well, the FBI is investigating that. Every answer was the FBI is investigating this. And so in some ways it kind of landed in your lap, and I appreciate you being here. But, you know, it's just, for me, the question of how does a 20-year-old acting alone get a long gun, a rangefinder? We know he bought a ladder. I guess he recon-aired and realized he didn't need the ladder to get on top of the building, so he left it at the house. Get on a roof within 150 yards of one of the most famous people in the world, I guess now, and a former president. How does that happen? And how do we restore trust in the American people that the FBI and the DHS, who is under Mayorkas's directorate now, how do we verify and get trust back to the American people that these agencies are really working to protect the president? And I'm not trying to place blame specifically, but I never thought that we'd raid his house. I never dreamed that they'd raid a former president's house. I certainly never imagined that they would actually indict him. And I felt, well, they'll never find him guilty. And now we've had a threat on his life. So how do we restore trust in the government of this country and the agencies that are here that we pay and provide $3 billion a year to the Secret Service to protect some of the leading political candidates in America? That's a lot. I'm sorry. That's a lot of questions. But I'm going to give you a little room to talk.
Right. No. Listen, obviously you included a lot, as you said, in your question. And as you might imagine, I disagree fairly strongly with a number of parts of it. But sensitive to the time, I guess what I would say this. I can speak to my approach to running the FBI. Again, the FBI was not involved in the physical security of the rally. That's, we come in as the investigators afterwards. And as I've said before, our investigation is an investigation of the shooter and his attack. There are separate investigations, the Inspector General of DHS and this outside independent panel that's been announced that would be looking at the Secret Service's performance. And those, I think, will be important to trust and confidence, if you will, in Secret Service. But from the FBI perspective, we can't promise that everybody's going to like the results of what we do, right? What we can promise is that we're going to do our best to do the work in the right way. That's all we can do. And so I keep telling our folks every day on this and on everything else, our focus has to be, we got to do the work in the right way. We got to make sure we do the work in the right way, and then no matter who likes it, because everything we do, somebody doesn't like it.
And it's a credibility issue at this point. Do the American people trust what the FBI and the DOJ is going to tell them? And, that's the thing with this. When I was early on, and I've only been here about 3.5, 4 years now, but the American people was the fear of the weaponization of government. So now we have this issue. Tucker Carlson asked the president, he said, are you afraid they'll kill you? And I remember that interview, and I thought, wow, I can't believe he went there. But here we are. And so as we work through this process, I think it's so important, and I think the chairman hit on this, is the audio of the shooter. You've interviewed the sniper, the Secret Service sniper that took out the target. Was he waiting on a green light? What was going on, and why did Mr. Crooks have a chance to get off 8 rounds? And we knew he was on the rooftop. I don't know for how long, but we know he was a marked target. So was he trying to get the green light, and was somebody not giving it to him?
So again, the performance, the adequacy of the performance of Secret Service will be the subject of the Inspector General investigation and this outside independent panel. What I can tell you, and I'm glad you asked the question, because this goes to something that that was part of an earlier exchange. The first time that anybody from law enforcement saw the subject on the roof was a few minutes before the shooting. Not with a gun. They didn't, at that point, they didn't, but local law enforcement, a few minutes before, saw him on the roof and started radioing.
Did he have a backpack going up the roof?
Well, we haven't found anybody yet who saw him climbing up the roof. The reason why I've talked